Okay, now we'll call our meeting to order. If we could, Shelley will give us an invocation.
Dear Heavenly Father, thank you for another beautiful and glorious day. Please watch over us today as we do the business of the county and work hard to make great improvements in things that we are doing in the county. Please watch over us, guide us, guard us, and direct us. In Jesus Christ's name I pray. Amen.
Amen. Thank you. The agenda is shown here. Is there a motion?
I make a motion to approve.
Okay. Ms. Tucker? Yes. Make the motion. Mr. Dyer, second.
You can just say passage without objection.
Passage, thank you. We're going to learn all sorts of good stuff. No public to recognize today. Approval of the minutes from July 31st.
So moved.
Thank you, Mr. Hyde.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Well, we're just going to say, I don't remember what you said we're going to say, so we'll vote on it this time. Get the language correct, too. Okay. Just want to share a few things with you on our topic. What's named here as the nonprofit analysis, that is the detailed spreadsheet that Jessica included in our agenda packet for today. Additionally, they have the nonprofit contribution, and they've taken that back quite a few years for us so that we can capture any of the nonprofits that had been awarded funding in years past. If you go to page 5 of your agenda, you'll see that it was in fiscal year 2008, where there were a number of different agencies that we were supporting, and then in fiscal year 2009 is when funding was cut way back. So that history just might give us some other agencies to be aware of that maybe once looked to the county for support. So thank you for getting all that history. And then the final 2 pages. I wasn't trained for this part. One second. It said it stopped capturing. Okay, the final 2 pages of your packet include a draft resolution that at some point, hopefully, we'll bring this forward to the commission for approval. So I want to kind of talk about what's in there and how it got to that language. And so I've got some notes here. I'm going to reference them just because I don't want to miss anything. But within the resolution, you'll see, and with the analysis, both of those things that I've been working through. My goal is just to make sure as we go into the next budget cycle that we have a really clear understanding of why we are allocating taxpayer funds to nonprofit organizations, and then clarify under what circumstances we will continue to do so going forward. And so I believe that it's important. It's our responsibility to consider these agencies, but to really be looking more carefully at their performance and better understand what their contributions are to the community if we are to continue offering financial support. So last time we met, we talked about all these different nonprofit agencies, and I know that as we left, we kind of talked about a few different, the terminology of what is essential services, what are required services because we have contracts, and then everything else, things that are beneficial to the community. And so as I started looking through the analysis and looking at the agencies that we funded, I was trying to use that terminology and fit things into those buckets to see if it made sense. And as I continue to do that, at the end, the biggest thing that stands out is that our rural fire departments are in a class all their own. It is true to say that they're essential. It's true to say that we, are required to provide some financial support. But in the end, I believe that most all the agencies on our current list, those that we funded this year. God bless you.
I tried to hold it in, it just made it worse.
I would say that every agency on the list, or just about every agency that we have on our list, that someone believes that service to be essential to them, whether it's their livelihood or their health or their safety. So what I found is going through the analysis and trying to use those terms and try to fit what we've done into those buckets to see if it made sense. I felt that those terms were limiting and that they were too maybe maybe controversial is the right word, or debatable. To say one thing is essential and another thing is not is a hard line to cross. So that's where at least I came to the draft that I've given you for consideration for our discussion as far as the resolution. So I basically, when I look at these categories, I ended up with 3 categories of agencies that we're currently supporting, and they fall into these 3 buckets of fire departments being all to themselves, unique and different, and really a different conversation in my mind, and so I kept those in one category. The second category I've called economic development and environmental protection. I'll probably simplify that, just call it economic and environmental. But those, by and large, are the agencies that we came out of here the last time considering as required, meaning that we have a contract or there's some kind of overarching agreement, whether it's a private act, some other state statute, or contract that is governing the relationship we have with those agencies. Not all of them. So as an example, the Tennessee Small Business Development Center, it has an economic development function. That might be the rationale for why we contribute to that agency, but they are not governed by a contract. So it's not an all-inclusive. I just want to be clear that those are not just the ones that we would have said were required that we have a contract. But then the third category has one way or another of safeguarding vulnerable persons, whether it's seniors, it's domestic situations, children. It's kind of the everything else. It's what most of our local nonprofit charitable organizations fall into that category. So those were the ones that made sense to me as I went through all this. And again, that's why I proposed it as part of the resolution for us to discuss. I've talked with dozens of people in the last month. Some people reached out to me with feedback, knowing that we were looking at the nonprofit strategy and had some ideas. These are just some things I heard, and I just want to bring them to the table for your consideration if you haven't heard the same things. One comment is as far as the current process, so we have the current outside agency funding request. This is the packet that agencies will get when they are coming to us and requesting funding. And so I heard from more than one that the spreadsheet that we added to that process not too long ago, that was just confusing. And when you look at my spreadsheet, when I did more analysis, you can see that we're not getting consistent numbers from that in terms of like their overall operating budget and such. A lot of the agencies just aren't really sure how to work with it. So the spreadsheet that we've been using is causing some confusion. So that's one piece of feedback. A couple of the agencies pointed out that our application, it's 4 or so pages, and there's a lot of details around projects and performance measures and expenses and other ways that they categorize their short-term and long-term projects and outcomes, and that it is a lot of work. And just as a point of reference, again, just so for your edification and knowledge, they would say our process is quite cumbersome compared to the amount of funding that's been available. Not that they wouldn't do it, but that might be why some of the agencies maybe have fallen off the list and maybe received funding at one point but haven't come back, because they can spend a lot less, I don't want to say effort, because I think they all have somebody that's going to write grants, and they write them, and once they write them once, it's not difficult to come back to the table again. But there's just a definite difference in the effort to the available funding that they might find in other agencies or municipalities. A lot of people had different agencies. They were asking, why aren't we not funding things like legal aid or habilitation and training services or CASA or Anti-Drug Coalition? These were ones that came up multiple times in conversations. People asked, the Sumner County Museum was asked why we were not funding those, or at least not currently. Many people really came back and said that as far as the funding decisions, that they would hope that as a county we were looking at performance metrics, that we were looking at some bit of information about the outcomes. How many people are they serving? What is their operating expense to overhead? That we were looking at some of those key measures when we determine whether or not we're going to fund an agency. And so I could have missed part of that, but during the budgeting process this year, I don't think that we go and we collect that information, and I know that there is a review of it, but it's pretty high level, and I don't think a lot of those involved in the budgeting process are really kind of digging into that level of detail. So that was offered. Just a couple other points I'll offer, and then we'll have some discussion. Several people mentioned that it would be helpful if the agencies that we're providing funding to had a profile on GuideStar or Giving Matters. Some of those are opt-in, where as a nonprofit agency you can go out to Giving Matters, I know personally, I've done this where it asks a lot of information about your expenses and your operating projects and your metrics and all the things you're doing, all the background and history on your organization. And so that is publicly available information, and within it, it just it provides a basis of information and might help remove some of the things that we try to collect on top of what might be already available online through something like GuideStar or Giving Matters. And then lastly, one comment, this one, well, let me skip this one because that was really wordy and it's kind of hard to wrap your head around. So anyway, that was some of the feedback I heard. So that's where we get to kind of what I've given us as a draft. But this spreadsheet, I know there's a lot of information, and I just want to point out a few things. What I did is I brought into this analysis everything that we have currently provided funding to in the current fiscal year, captured whether it is coming out of our general fund or the hospital fund. I've brought forward from our budget workshops. We have, I can show you, these are the spreadsheets that were available to the budget committee that came from each of the nonprofits. And so these little, this is the level of detail that's coming into the budget committee to look at a nonprofit agency request. And so within here, you'll see operating expense. And that's what I've added here, kind of in the very middle of the spreadsheet, the operating expense. And as you can see, some of the ones that are highlighted, for example, a few of the county fire departments, they might have received $24,000 from us, but they're saying that their operating expenses are only $18,000. So something is, misunderstood in providing this information. So I'm not saying that we're giving 128% of their funding. They're just, there's some confusion in filling that out. And so some of them, though, as you look at the list, something that might be interesting is the senior centers. They're a little kind of midway down on the spreadsheet. We are giving anywhere from 9 to 34% of the operating expenses, if in fact we're getting good information, again, on that spreadsheet. But we are providing a pretty significant level of total funding towards those senior centers, whereas some of the other nonprofit agencies further down towards the bottom, you'll see it's anywhere from 0 to 2% of some of the local nonprofit agencies. So just a note, it's just some things to try to absorb and consider whether or not that is what it should be. I've designated where we know we have a contract or a private act or a grant. They have done their best between Mr. Long and Ms. Denon and their offices. They've done what they could to find and provide background information on these agencies where there is some kind of contract. And it's sparse, admittedly. So I think that's part of what you'll see in the resolution as far as how I think we should try to handle those going forward. What's that?
Most of them are annual because they would have been approved by the commission. So
Yeah, and they're,
the only thing I could find was a 5-year lease for like the building over here, but we didn't have any kind of agreements with any of the nonprofits I could find.
A 5-year lease for, what was that you were talking about?
The building for,
Rehabilitation center.
yeah.
Oh,
we have
okay.
a lease for
Yeah.
them, but we don't have a contract going the other direction. And the one for the state statutes, if you look at it, it says if the county's willing to fund it, so it's not really a requirement either. So
That's still, you're talking about the Tennessee rehabilitation?
Mhm.
Yeah. Well, I think we can take each of those kind of in their own stead, because they're complicated. Bless you. Anyway, so that's some of the data that's provided. At the bottom of the spreadsheet, you do see at the very bottom the $1,792,000. That is the amount that we approved. That when we approved our budget, there were 2 resolutions. One for the nonprofits that matches that 1.7 million, and then another resolution that approved the remainder of our budget. What I didn't have when I first gave this to Jessica and them, and you might want to take note of these. This data I think is actually really useful as you start to consider these buckets, if it's essential, required, or beneficial, or if we use the terminology that I proposed. What I did is I just subtotaled what our current year giving is, or the contributions. So rural fire departments are receiving, and you don't have this with you, so if you want to take this note, rural fire departments in total are receiving $450,000, which is 25% of our total nonprofit contribution. The second category that I've called economic development and environmental protection, again, includes tourism, Forward Sumner, includes resource authority in many of these areas where we have a contract. That is a total of it's 1,251,086, which is 70% of the total budget. And then that's bottom categories that I've called safeguarding vulnerable persons. That's 88,171 of the total, and that's 5%. And worth noting, out of that 88,000, I don't have the math in front of me, but it's 40, 50, it's about 52,000 of that 88 that's going to the senior centers currently. So it's a big portion of what ends up being the smallest portion of our allocations. So I tried not to do analysis paralysis to get stuck in this, but I really was trying to make sense of it and figure out a path forward. So wanted to make sense of the analysis that I shared, and so that will conclude my comments. David, do you want to offer anything else for everyone's consideration?
Just when we look through the contracts, as was stated earlier, they're very sparse, single year. We have one with the Regional Transportation Authority, but it's for one fiscal year. We have, it looks like what I can tell, they're all single fiscal year agreements. And then we have two private acts involved, which is $350 for tourism and $100,000, and the Resource Authority, but it just says 3/7 of any amounts. It doesn't have the $100,000 spelled out
3/7
of any kind of deficit at
deficit.
the end. And then one more thing I want to be clear of: we do pay 3/7 of their other operations, such as utilities and other costs, directly. As it's not a donation, we actually pay 3/7 of their bills and are billed monthly, in addition to what's shown on.
In addition to, so the the Resource Authority, I should have numbered these line items, sorry. Okay, so it's near the bottom. That 100,000 that was budgeted, are we, I know that's the amount that's been budgeted each year. Is that the amount that we have?
Paid
then
each year.
Paid each year as well?
It's paid
Okay.
each year, and then we pay an additional amount for two things. Currently, it's for utilities and other costs at the existing landfills and the operation, and we've been paying for the Caps Gap closure, which has been quite expensive.
What's that called again, the cap?
I think it's Caps Gap.
C-A-P-P-S.
Caps
Caps
Gap.
Gap. Is that a piece of equipment, or is that a
It's
person's
the
name
old
that's-
landfill that we're closing.
Got it, that's,
Right.
okay.
It's the old landfill closure that was thought to be closed, that was later discovered or argued it hasn't been closed.
Got it. It
And-
has issues.
And then all the other ones were paid per budget on the sheet, except for the
Portland Airport?
Portland Airport, and it's a $250,000 total taken out of the hospital funds and up to $50,000 a year until that expires, was the original understanding. It was done through budgetary process. I don't believe it ever went to resolution, but it's been done through the budgetary
I
process.
believe there was a resolution.
Was the resolution? It was discussed, but I can't remember if it ever went to the floor.
And so how are we determining how much we allocate them each year? Is that they're coming to us and saying, this is what I need?
The 50,000 was subject to being a grant match. So they send my office the grant match information each year. If it's below $50,000, then we verify that it is the grant match. They paid it, and then we pay it over to the airport.
And are we matching a certain grant or just their full collection of grants that they bring in?
It was originally just grants. It was to be used for grant matches.
They're like our airport authority.
Mm-hmm.
Whenever you fly, there's like an $18 tax, and none of that goes to rural airports, and none of it goes to urban airports. The urban airport stuff is swallowed almost immediately. The rural airports, they have a lot of money, but they never will give you 100% grant. There are certain things that you get 20%, where you match 80%, all the way up to, they give you 95%, and you pay 5%. It just depends on the federal government, and if you think about it, they want more runways built, because obviously they need places for people to land planes if we were in an emergency situation. So runways are usually 95.5. Fueling stations are usually real high up like that. Building a new building, not so much, maybe 50-50. But there are all sorts of things, and so that was what they would do, is apply for grants that met their needs, and we would give them $50,000 for that. So it could be
any
everything from
grant.
sewer line extensions to,
Got it.
No.
Okay.
It's any grant was the original discussion. It was a match on any grant that they could obtain, up to $50,000 a year
Mm-hmm.
for a total of $250,000, and then could be revisited at the end of the $250,000.
And that was as you said, coming out of hospital funds, right?
Right, there was
So-
250 moved from the hospital funds, and there's a 160,931 as of the end of the June 30th
Remaining,
fiscal
okay.
year.
And where was it moved into the general fund?
It was
Or-
moved into another reserve in the general fund for the Portland Airport. So it's just another reserve, so there's 160,000 sitting over there for that purpose right now.
Okay. That helps explain it at least. So as you look down, like, so if you're looking at those little skinny columns in the middle where it says, is there some kind of overarching agreement? The first one is tourism, we talked about that, the 350 is part of a private act. The Portland Airport, we just talked about, is really a resolution.
It was.
Is that what you said, Leah, there was a resolution?
We believe there's a resolution, it was done through budget. There may or may not be a resolution, we'd have to verify that.
Okay. So that's something we want to potentially confirm. The Tennessee Rehabilitation Center, this has been explained several times, we have a contract with the state. They have determined that they're going to pay us $158,745 in rent, and so we make that nonprofit contribution to them to offset the rent income that we're receiving. So this is a net zero to continue to keep that program running.
They have a
Is that
5-year
right?
lease with us.
Oh, what?
The state has a 5-year lease with
Right,
us.
okay, right. And then the workforce essentials.
They're using it as a grant match.
What's that, the
It's
match?
been used as a grant match.
It's been used as a grant match, sort of similar to the airport, but it's not, we don't have any kind of long-standing,
It was done through the school system, then it left, and then it was done by Ball State. Now it's been moved over to Workforce Essentials. But the whole time, the $40,000 has been used toward matching for grants for the adult ed program. That was the understanding of the commission several years back.
and then, I'm gonna skip over Mid-Cumberland for just one second. The forestry, did everybody get the forestry contract from 1958?
58, 59. It's to develop a plan for fire protection, but it's my understanding that the plan included the tower, wherever Commissioner Taylor told us last month. And the understanding is to continue operating that tower that we have to contribute the $2,000 a year. I forget where he said it was at. It's not in that contract. The contract is just to develop and maintain a plan from
This has to be
1958
the
to 59.
most, cost-effective thing that's never gone up for 50, 60 years. It's been $2,000 a year, pretty much since that, that's what the original contract
Yep.
specifies. And then Regional Transportation Authority, Resource Authority is there, we talked about that, as far as the 3/7, and then Regional Transportation Authority, that $55,597
Annual
is
contract.
an annual contract, and, when do we review that contract?
It's
Is it
signed after the budget was approved this
after
year,
the-
because we pulled it, or I pulled it.
And do we have a good sense for what governs the amount?
Yes, it's a portion, I believe it's a joint between the other counties.
Well,
I did read all these.
basically what it comes down to is they pay us what they think the rent ought to be, based on whatever the square footage is and the quality of the building and what the building offers.
We're talking about the Transportation Authority.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
I think
I'm
it's
sorry.
based on a
That's all
percentage
right.
through the counties, and we have their documentation upstairs if you want me to
That's
obtain it.
right. No, I haven't.
It's based on the percentages between the counties, several of them.
Just because we know what it is doesn't mean that we don't have more questions about it as we go into next year's budget process, now that we're peeling the layers back on all of this.
We could next month, if you want us to bring those packets, but they're rather, I don't know if the committee wants to try to go through all those. That was my thought. I mentioned that to Jessica today. We could copy those to bring them down this evening, but it was kind of questionable whether you'd want to go through.
Not today.
Or not.
And it might be a subset of this committee, or I think we'll decide how best we want to proceed with that. But, okay, now we all have all the information that we all have. So, discussion, both the listing and the proposed resolution. I am very open to feedback and input. Has everybody had a chance to digest the resolution as it's written? 'Cause if not, I can kind of give you the cliff notes on it. For the edification of the the owl. I'll just say that what I've done is basically captured the fact that statute sets the expectation in a sense, but certainly outlines that county governments are fully enabled to make contributions to both nonprofit charitable organizations and civic organizations. The next two whereas bullet points give a little better description of what is defined by, or what we mean when we say charitable organization or civic organization. And then the final whereas Sumner County residents receive myriad benefits as a result of these services provided by nonprofit agencies, and often there would be a considerable cost to the county if these services were not provided. So therefore be it resolved that we would be administering grants for these categories, and the three categories I've talked about, and they're a little further described or defined in the resolution. The proposition is that within the resolution that we would take our contributions to rural fire departments, as well as those economic and environmental agencies, and include those in our annual budget review process. And that might mean, in this case, we're waiting for CTAS and probably another ad hoc committee that's going to look at rural fire departments, so that we go into hopefully next year's budget cycle and know what we want to do around rural fire, and not burden the rest of the nonprofits with that conversation. Because as much as it is a nonprofit and I want it to be part of our conversation, I think it is still separate and distinct from how we might look at all of these contracts we were just talking about that fall into the economic and environmental category. What's remaining, and those that are listed as safeguarding vulnerable persons, my proposal is that we pull those outside of the standard annual budget process, and we set aside during that process an amount of funding, and we can use history as a guideline so that the budget committee can establish a funding level should we choose to continue to fund agencies of this category, and then use a review panel to look at that next layer of detail, so that we can look at metrics and outcomes and projects and use our collective knowledge, maybe have another ad hoc committee, potentially involve community members or staff members if I think we could create the panel, and that's not being defined in detail in the resolution, but to create a panel to look at those other agencies in a greater level of detail. And it also proposes that we use the amounts that have been defined in the past, that as a new agency that we would start with $2,500 as a first year, and that those amounts could be increased by $2,500 in subsequent years. It also sets forth the expectation that charitable donations will only be considered during the annual budget process. And I do wonder if we can uphold that, because I know we have certainly given grant funding to some community centers. There was just recently a $3,500 amount that was given to Regional Transit Alliance, and those were done outside of the annual process. So, is that an expectation that we could uphold?
I believe those were out of capital funds, like just the community centers were out of capital funds of some kind. In other words, we were given something for building purposes. It wasn't funding them to
Operations.
Operations, correct. That we were putting a roof on the Castile Springs Community Center and things like that.
Yeah.
It doesn't really matter what we choose to do here. If 13 people on the commission at any one meeting decide to do something else, there's no way that won't be legal.
Makes sense. Yep.
I'm just saying that
Yep.
for what we're talking about here,
Right.
budget-wise, I don't really believe that's what those things
that would be-
particularly were. Those were a one-time
Right.
expense kind of thing.
The repair of the
They were
buildings.
unique. They were unique, and so I think they're, and you're right, Mr. Hyde, that whatever we agree here as a resolution, should it be agreed here and then passed to the committee or to the commission for passage, it is only a go-forward plan that certainly can be changed as needed. So, other feedback, thoughts?
I'm just curious about whether we should continue with some of the things on the listing. I'm just going to throw out an example, not that they should be cut, but just an example. You take, for instance, the Sumner County, the Sumner Teen Center. And I know some of the people that were involved in organizing that, and great people, and it's a worthy project. But then when you open certain doors, what excludes us from contributing to Boy Scouts, Girl Scouts, on and on and on, because I've been a fundraiser, county-wide fundraiser twice for Boy Scouts, once for Girl Scouts. And so I know they do raise money and they need money and they solicit county money.
Right.
So what, how do you define?
I agree.
what we-
I agree, and that's where I think a panel, Sumner Teen Center included, really, the ones that are all highlighted as this kind of third category, safeguarding vulnerable persons. It's everything from your Gallatin Senior Center, including Mid-Cumberland, Ashley's Place, Home Safe, Salvis, Cumberland Crisis, Sumner Teen Center. That group of agencies that we funded this year, I believe that a panel review process could help differentiate and delineate between those that are providing a service that the county cannot otherwise provide, providing a service that would cost the county if it was not provided, or other important criteria, as defined by that panel. But I agree. I mean, I think that there's definitely a variation. Now, I want to highlight, I haven't talked about Ashley's Place yet, but I did do a lot of research here. And it had been proposed to me by a couple other commissioners that Ashley's Place, given their role within the Sheriff's Department, they play, if you're not familiar with Ashley's Place, they conduct forensic interviews of children that have gone through an abusive situation, whether it's sexual abuse or other physical abuse. And they conduct that forensic interview on video while it is being watched by the detective, while it's being watched by DCS, so the interviewer is trained in not only managing the child, but also not ever using leading questions. It's a very carefully organized process that is, in all respects, from everyone I've talked to, from the DA's office to the Sheriff's Department, it's a critical service. Those interviews are, they're just a life changer, and they really protect those children, but they also create a standardized process that the Sheriff's Department really depends upon, because they bring those individuals, DCS and the detective, they come back to the table once a month and they meet at Ashley's Place facility to continue down the process of convicting whoever is behind it. So that is an example, and I don't know how we would exactly do this, Lee. I know I've kind of mentioned it to you, but I think that it does stand out. And so you've got within that spectrum, you've got ones that our county really cannot function without, which maybe is kind of like our description about rural fire. But, when you're looking at this category of safeguarding vulnerable persons, that's a type of service that we really can't function without. We can't just say that we're not going to fund it this year because we don't have enough money. So could we look at putting in place a contract with Ashley's Place to conduct forensic interviews for the Sheriff's Department?
And yes, I mean, we can definitely do that, and it might be something where you want to start saying, tell us how many
The full board would have to.
of these do
Yeah,
you do?
interviews are.
And so that we've kind of got more of a, and because, and I don't know this, but at one point, I thought Ashley's Place was being used by other agencies as well. So we might need to dig
Yeah.
down more into that, just like, you and I were talking about that some of these organizations, it's real hard to get in. Others, they help anybody that walks in the door. And so do we need to
Yeah.
get more of an analysis of is the service providing
Right.
what it should?
What we expected to, which is where, if a contract were to be pursued, I think that's the kind of detail that we would expect in that process. So it's just, it might be a helpful way of looking at that full spectrum of different agencies. As I went through this again and again and again and again, I didn't see any other agencies that really passed that same litmus test as far as being eligible for something like what I'm just describing with Ashley's Place. But back to the point, I do think that stuff all gets settled when you go through a panel, or you bring all of those into a panel discussion. Yeah.
The reason we have such a few amount of those contracts for multi-years, if they have a fiscal year impact, they actually have to be approved by the commission. So if they're going to carry across those fiscal years, they would have to go to the full board.
Well, and And I'm an advocate for so many of these groups, but I also think that we have to look at them from year to year, because sometimes you can have the organization that is just stellar, and then the people running it change, and it doesn't continue on. So I wouldn't want them to get complacent and think, oh, well, the county's always gonna give me $5,000, because
Right.
they're gonna need to keep their statistics up and the paperwork and that sort of thing.
So it really makes sense for any of these contracts to be no more than a year. Feels like the Portland airport might be one of the only outliers that really had a multi-year kind of agreement with it, if I'm not mistaken. I mean, these others we've been doing for a long time. We haven't necessarily been digging beneath the covers to make sure it still meets our needs, but it's really been a 1 year. So I would think no different if we were to pursue that. So to that point, I know that one of the points in the resolution is that any kind of contractual agreement would have no more than a 5-year agreement and would always be reviewed, but I think that can be changed. That's in point B in the therefore on page 1 of the resolution.
I personally feel like the wording for C is a little strong. On the safeguarding vulnerable persons, that's pretty strong language, and I could probably go down that list right now and say that there are things in there that I personally don't believe fit in that category. Other people would necessarily think they fit in that category, but it just seems to me like that's a pretty strong statement. And if that were to be the case in the wording, then you're automatically excluding any of those that we don't think belong on there from that, which is okay. But, it's the same kind of thing, when you start saying we're going to safeguard vulnerable persons, and I also, in a way, think that makes it tougher to turn down people when they come, when we know that their particular organization is doing something that safeguards vulnerable persons. Maybe I'm making a big deal out of that. I don't know. I just feel like that wording is strong on that particular thing for C.
Yeah.
With service to vulnerable persons.
Well, and I don't even know if it's even, safeguarding is a pretty strong word for
Yeah,
sure
I
there.
agree. Yeah.
And I'm not sure it even needs to be vulnerable persons. I think it needs to be something that is, say, providing service to, citizens in some way or whatever else. I just don't know. That just seems, it jumps out at me when I read through this.
Right.
That jumped out at me as just pretty strong wording.
And I like Mr. Hyde's comment about service. And maybe we just say service to citizens, because that's another thing that I think we've got to be real careful about, is to make sure they are serving our citizens. And not that I'm gonna, and our example, and this isn't a charitable thing, but we have to bury bodies that get abandoned. And that's one of the things the county has to do. And used to they were buried in the Pottersfield, now we have to cremate them because we don't really have a Pottersfield anymore. And we used to get maybe 1 a year. Now we get about 2 a month. And a lot of times we get people that died here, but they didn't live here. And when that happens, if we can, we call their home county and say, you need to handle this, not ours, because yes, it's only $550, but it's $550 of county money. Now, after they've sat in our morgue for 30 days and nobody's claimed them, we're gonna pay to do it. But we at least try. I mean, we offer them to the body farm from time to time. There's other options that we look at first, because I feel very zealous that we're doing it for Sumner County residents, not for somebody that just happened to come out here and pass away.
It's not a nonprofit contribution, but it is a good example of how we are servicing our citizens. And I'm very amenable to that. I was looking to create separate and distinct categories, but at the same time, I was really kind of looking for that catch-all of those agencies that really don't have a contract and they're not rural fire. because I feel like those are two separate entities that we need to deal with separately. So I would be very amenable to it being broader and not so.
Right, and I mean, I don't know exactly what wording we should put there or whatever else, but I mean, and again, if we're providing some money to some senior centers, but we're not necessarily safeguarding people in that center, kind of thing. So I believe service is probably a better word, and I don't know what we want to do about the vulnerable part of it, because again, I mean, I guess maybe they're vulnerable, but I don't know if they are or not. We're giving money to these,
Yeah.
and
It
so,
could just be serving our citizens.
something along those lines or whatever else. And there was, a couple other things that you mentioned as well, and people coming and saying that they don't apply for this because it is difficult to do the paperwork. We're already turning away quite a few people. I don't know, do you have any idea how many, but we're already turning quite a few people away.
This shows the ones that came to us this year that we turned
Yeah,
away flatly.
and different things like that or whatever else. So, I mean, I don't necessarily know that we want to make it easier to apply. There may be something specific you're saying that they really can't get or whatever else. I don't have any problem with any of that either, but quite frankly, the things that I've heard from Budget and all, they're wanting to cut more of these, not less, and not bring more of them. So I just don't know that. And let me just say too, on the fire department end of it, and y'all know I'm heavily involved in that. These guys have not been used to really reporting stuff to us. We started that through the Emergency Services Committee about a year or two ago or whatever else, and we are still working on that, and they're going to have to step up their reporting as well. We're going to be giving this money, they've got to step up and participate, or we just need to knock them off the list. And I've already said that specifically about one particular group on there. So, but if we need to make the application clearer, maybe even if we need to take something particular off that is very difficult for them to get or something like that, that's fine. But as far as making the process necessarily easier, I don't know that that's something we want to do.
I think it's got to be both sides of it. If you don't mind me commenting real quick, that the application as it's presented, it is cumbersome. It's not an online application that grows and fills. It's a Word document, and so this little box, right? Is it an online?
It's a PDF form that we sent to them.
So
It's a fillable PDF and a fillable Excel form.
got it. So they are okay
They have the option to do it,
Yeah.
if they want to.
if they want to.
It's hard to get
So-
people to do those.
Okay, so some of the fields are, some of it, but probably the other side of it is what I'm more concerned about. So if we were to put together a panel to look at all applicants, and let's say there were 20 applicants that come into this grant request category, a panel has to be able to digest what they're telling us as well in a manner that is efficient for one set of, for one way of putting it. It has to be something that a committee can work through without it turning into I guess what I'll compare it to, I don't know if anybody's ever been on a United Way panel, but within United Way, they conduct site visits. They have all-day panels for 4 or 5 agencies, or maybe 6 or 7 that fall into a certain category. So let's say all the agencies that are education panels or education agencies. Each person will have visited them. Their applications take about an hour to review, and then you sit down for an all-day review panel with that subset, and then there's a panel for each of, I think, 4 different high-level categories. In any case, it's a really time-intensive process, but they're allocating usually $8, $10 to $30, $40, $50,000. So it's sort of it's consistent. So a grant that's offering $2,500, I'm just saying, I think that we can look at it. I think we can take some cues from others. I've been trying to gather some of the other grant applications that are around. And as long as we're reviewing it, if we're able to really digest the information that's on there, I think then that's really the test. So.
Should we bring back the form to the next meeting to look at? Maybe the most logical next step, but to mention something that Alan said earlier, what generally happens at budget, it comes in each year, and the budget's far out of balance. And because of financial constraints, everything's cut back, including the not-for-profits. That's why they are so much
Yeah.
lower than original request. So logistically speaking, you start with the budget and it's shrunk down during that small time frame to get the budget. So this committee here would probably have to have some kind of front-end cue from budget to determine what would be available to work backwards.
And that's the thought, is that if budget can say, okay, if we spent 88,000 this year in this category of serving our citizens, or whatever we call it, if we can allocate that amount for next year, we'll agree to that when the county approves the budget, and then the panel will process, I would say at that point, that would be my preference, is to say, at that point, we know whether we have more or less funding than we had last year. So now we can tell potential grant applicants, that gives them a trigger as to whether or not they should invest the effort to complete the grant application and come to meet with us. And, I mean, one of the things that I think, the reason that I got heavily involved in this and been kind of looking at it in such detail is that there were a lot of agencies that spent a lot of time and are really good agencies, but because of the process and the cumbersome nature of trying to come in and tell your story for 5 minutes to a budget committee, you couldn't really fairly evaluate, should I still give $5,000 to Salva Center and $2,500 to Sumner Teen Center, or should maybe I give some of that money to Children or People or Legal Aid or HATS? There was really no way to balance that set of requests against each other to look at what is the most important investment for the county. It was the only logical thing to do with the time constraints that we were working within, to say, we have no additional funding, so no new funding. You get what you got last year, and we'll continue on. And I just think that was a disservice to those who spent the hours and hours that would have been involved in completing their grant request. If they knew that our funding was so limited that it would have changed their behavior.
I think that is difficult, and I understand that. I think it's possible they may be able to give you some kind of an amount or whatever else, but there's no guarantee that it's going to be the real amount when it gets to the budget. You know what I'm saying? Because they may have thought they were going to have X number of dollars for it this year, and by the time they really got the budget and decided that, well, we're going to have to do this or whatever else, it might have been considerably less than that. And so I think there are issues in both ways on that, and I'm agreeing
Yeah.
with what you're saying. But I'm also saying, I just want to say that, they may tell you 6 months ahead of time that they're going to have $88,000, and when they get to the budget process, they may have $50,000.
And I'm saying we don't start this process until the commission approves the budget.
There's two things that
If
play
we
into
could-
that. Is you've got a general fund that has hundreds of revenues, and every one of them is affected by dozens of things. For instance, last year, there was a court case about taking driver's license for not paying your court fees. It affected the county negatively by about $500,000 last year. The county had to deal with that. So you have those, and they come down the stream all the time. That came down after the budget was approved during the year, about 3 months in.
That's what some of the counties I talked to, that's what they've gone to, is, in August, July, whenever, they pass their budget. And at the final budget time, they say, okay, we've got $50,000 for services, we've got $100,000 for this, we've got $500,000 for rural fire. And then they start the process with those groups, and those groups expect to get that money January 1.
Gives you time to
And
put it in
that
the
way-
paper.
That's what I'm trying to propose.
I understand what you're
Yeah.
saying. I did not understand that's what
Yeah,
you're saying.
sorry.
Yeah, if we're saying we're passing this much, and then you're gonna take it and do it,
Actual
yeah,
budget.
I'm involved in
The
that.
only thing you gotta think about is some of those agencies are gonna get their money much later or not at all, so they probably would, we
Which
get
is-
to notify
yeah.
them now.
It's one of our follow-ups, because I think after our first meeting, I had said that we should put all agencies that are receiving funding this year on notice that we are looking at changing our process going forward.
And January 1 would be the earliest that any money will be available.
So,
Still, outside agencies have a statutory right, what you're gonna run into is all outside agencies have a statutory right to present to that committee and to the commission.
Well, and they still do that.
That's what I'm saying, if
but
we're gonna do
Sure.
it this other way before the budget, you kinda run into that issue if they're wanting to
I
ask for
don't think you
individual
have to
money.
do it beforehand, David. I think we can just go in and say, we're gonna have $500,000 or $1 million for charity, and then
The statute says agencies, which would include those.
I know that, but as long as you give them the opportunity to speak at some point,
Right.
you're meeting the statutory obligation.
For the budget.
The budget is a fluid thing that constantly changes.
So the budget next year, the budget committee,
Mhm.
as they go through and they look at rural fire and what are we allocating
Mhm.
here, what are we allocating for these contracts, what are we allocating for other servicing citizens, agencies, that would be a line item on the budget that would be
Right.
approved, and so anyone who wishes to speak to that line item, right? Would
Well,
that-
my concern, it says these agencies have a right to present the request pretty clearly, so if they're not presenting
And
that
David-
original draft budget, I'm
And
not.
David, they get to present it, but we're just figuring out ahead of time what the money's gonna be. It's kinda like, you know, and I'm thinking of this as church, the way our church does the budget, we set up the budget, they figure out what the lights are gonna cost, what the, you know, X, Y, and Z are gonna cost. And then, after it's all passed, the different departments come in and say, okay, we'd like to start a new program for preschoolers. Do we have an extra $500 for that? And they've set aside, you know, X amount of dollars for new programs. And I think you've got the right to say, we're going to have, you know, $2 million. Or you're still letting them come and talk about it, you're just setting their budget at a different time. Perfectly okay. David and I'll talk.
Yeah.
I was just saying, I was thinking the same
I mean, they
thing.
can come and
There's gotta be
speak.
answers out.
Several things, but
Just
yeah.
because they come and speak doesn't mean that they have a right to
Right.
receive funding. So
Right, you don't have
they're
to
welcome to
approve it.
come and speak to the budget committee
That's what I'm saying.
during the budget process, and that may influence the amount of money that's at that line item that will be allocated at a further date.
I think the first draft budget's gonna have to contain the request. Period, and you can move it back, cause it says that I will consolidate a budget with these agencies requesting it. It's in the actual statute.
But they could be last year's numbers. And we'll talk about it, this is not, we don't need to get into.
You're gonna, that's what I'm saying, that's what I think it's more of a logistical issue, but.
Well, it's logistical, but it's important, and it sort of goes back to what I said before, in that no matter what we do, if someone comes before budget and asks for $25,000 in budget votes to do it, and the county commission votes to do it, you can forget it, they've done it. So, you know, it's 6 of one, half dozen of another, in my opinion. I have a statement and a question for Leah. One is, I think, I haven't served several years on a United Way allocations committee. If people think that our system is cumbersome and difficult, they should go through that process. It's simple compared to that. And I think when we're dealing with the public's money, that it needs to be that way. If they're asking for 1,000 or 100,000, it needs to be that way. And on the flip side of that, as tight as money is, and as hard as citizens have been hit, I think my yardstick in measuring this would be, what are you saving us as a county by this service that you're providing? And if it's nothing or not much of anything, I can't be for it. But a lot of these agencies are, which leads me to the next question. We need to look at certain agencies, I think, if I understand them correctly, from years past, differently than others, and I'm talking about Mid-Cumberland. Now, if I remember correctly, Mid-Cumberland receives a great deal of federal funding. It's a huge agency. It's not even local. It was out of Murfreesboro at one point and it's contracted really with private individuals that provide the service. So that's a very unique animal that we're giving money to. That's probably, I would love to know what their total budget is. It's gotta be millions.
I would too.
But we need to look, I think, at agencies' ability to receive funding and secure funding versus those that really have a need.
I agree with you totally. That was one thing I was thinking, is that we need to, look at these agencies and ask them, what are your other sources of funding? And I'm with you, I was on a United Way board too, and I remember some of the organizations were coming to us for 5% of their funding. 95% of their funding was coming from federal agencies. And so while it was important that the United Way give, they knew they weren't gonna shut their doors if they didn't get the money from the United Way. And that's the thing with this. And then I go back to my whole thing of, is it our citizens? Because Mid-Cumberland, I don't know what they
Yeah.
do for us. I'd really like somebody to come in and say, this is what we're doing. I know at one point, didn't they teach driver's ed?
Well, they did that, and they had preschool programs. We had to get them out of one of our schools that had been abandoned, and they had quite a preschool and kindergarten program going on in that, and it was a good program. Meals on Wheels is a good program. The other things, securing travel to doctors' offices and so forth, good program. That's not the issue. I'm for all of those. It's how many millions of dollars are you getting from the federal government? And can we really balance that with our needs here when you may not even be in our county?
Is that something that is on our application?
That's for federal and state.
Other funding, what are your other funding sources, Wes?
But I do agree that that's really our next action item, to your point, and bring it here, and we can, look at it side by side with what some other options are. I don't mean to discredit it. And I didn't hear anything, it wasn't, I do want to make sure that I, don't throw any of these agencies under the bus. They know what it takes to get their money, and they just have to determine, where am I going to spend? I only have this much time to go after grants. And if this process is really cumbersome and I'm only really possibly going to get $2,500, I've got to spend that same amount of time where I can maybe get $5,000 to $10,000, because it's, it's just, and they have to make that determination. And I can't, they're all really strapped for those resources.
Leah, wasn't it about 4 years ago that was reworked, the actual application? Lauren worked on it and the
I
committee.
know, it's been a couple of years, I know that.
And then Mr.
That's
Foster.
not anything that has to be, it's not written in stone. I mean, we can redo that anytime you want.
Yeah. I think the budget committee's.
But I think that's a really good question, is to say, but see, I think they ought to tell us, our total budget is $4,2,500. What is your total budget?
Yeah.
And what are your other sources of income?
That's on the application and the other sheet and the one from the comptroller's office.
Yeah, if we do ask what is their, total operating budget, how much are they requesting, and we ask them to break down salaries, amount requested from the county,